People always ask me what it felt like, standing in that room when the Queen said those words. They want something dramatic from me, a trembling hand, a held breath, a moment of awe at the fact that the most powerful sovereign in 4-star systems had just looked across a marble table at a 63-year-old frontier officer and asked him why he'd refused her daughter. What I remember is that the morning light was coming through the tall glass panels on the east wall of the Accord Grand Reception Hall, cutting long pale bands across the floor. I remember the smell of the sea through the ventilation, salt and deep tide, the Atlantic doing what it has always done, indifferent to the fact that something entirely unprecedented was happening 20 meters from its shoreline. I remember the small sound my chair made when I shifted my weight, and the way the Queen's aide, a tall, silver-carapaced officer named Vorath Kelm, straightened almost imperceptibly at the noise, reading it as a preparation to speak. I had been assigned to the Varath Sen Royal Contact Formation 3 weeks before they arrived. That alone tells you something about how the Accord works. 3 weeks. The formation had been detected by the Frontier Monitoring Division's Outer Ring Buoy Network 11 months earlier, a tight cluster of 17 vessels moving at subfold cruise speed along approach vector Calith 7, decelerating in a pattern our analysts recognized as a formal diplomatic approach, not a military one. The fleet's drive signatures matched no active faction in the Theron Compact Registry. The hull profiles, however, matched archival records that were 46,000 years old. I want you to understand the size of that number. 46,000 years. The last time the Varath Sen had been in this system, the species that would become us had barely learned to store grain. They had come through this part of the arm and looked at the pale blue world with its scattered tribes and decided it was a colonial seeding prospect, a garden world for a species that was, in their assessment, 4,000 years from any civilization worth acknowledging. They left 3 survey beacons, conducted no landings, and filed a colonial development registration in the Theron Compact's predecessor registry under the designation holding Kale 19. Then they went home to their own wars and their own centuries and forgot about us entirely. We did not forget about them. The survey beacon was found by a deep ocean monitoring team 11,000 years after it was placed. The find was classified and routed to the Accord Archival Authority within the decade. The language embedded in the beacon's data packet took a generation to decode. The first team to work it called themselves the Kale Listeners. They had no idea what they had found at first, a registration number in a dead administrative dialect, a species assessment notation, coordinates pointing at this system from a world 600 light-years distant. They had a number. They had a filing. They had the beginning of a thread and they pulled it. Once we had the Varath Sen registration number, once we held their own compact filing in our hands, everything else followed with the patient, grinding certainty of a people who understand that the most important preparation is the one you begin before you know you need it. We traced the Theron intermediary networks backward through their own trading records. We found the Varath Sen's court session files archived in a compact repository on a neutral relay station 1,200 light-years distant. We sent analysts there, physical analysts, on a journey that took 40 years, and they came back with 11,000 documents in a language we were still learning to read. We built the Counter-Sovereignty Archive over 39,000 years. 39,000 years. I say it plainly because I want you to feel the weight of that preparation, not just the fact of it. Generation after generation of Accord legal historians, xenolinguists, charter analysts, and diplomatic archivists, each one inheriting a project they would not live to see completed, each one adding their section and passing the work forward. The archive ran to 312 million pages when it was certified. Every page was drawn from Varath Sen law. Their own founding charters, their own compact registrations, their own species development protocols, their own colonial claim statutes, their own precedent cases adjudicated over 46 millennia in courts we had tracked from records traded through Theron intermediaries. The archive didn't argue against their claim using human law. It argued against their claim using their own. There is a name recorded in the archive's first index, on the dedication page. Solith Kale, lead archivist of the founding generation, who began the project 200 years after the beacon was decoded and died 7 years into the work, having completed the first 40 pages. Her successor's name is there too, and the one after that, and the one after that. The final page of the dedication runs to 411,000 names, spanning 39,000 years of unbroken institutional memory. None of them knew if the Varath Sen were coming back. They worked anyway. That is the note I want you to carry through everything that follows. Humanity was not lucky. Humanity was not scrappy. We did not scramble a defense when the Varath Sen reappeared on our sensors. We had spent 39,000 years building the single most comprehensive legal refutation in the Compact's recorded history, and we had been waiting, with the exact quality of patience that only a species that has learned to remember can manage, for someone to show up and give us a reason to use it. My name is Davin Kelm. I am 63 years old. I spent 14 years as a Class 1 frontier monitor on the Calith Outer Approach String, 6 years as a frontier analysis coordinator at the Accord's Varathkale Deep Space Station, and the last 9 years as a senior first contact liaison, based out of the Accord Diplomatic Shore compound on the Atlantic coast. I had handled 11 contact events before the Varath Sen arrived. Not one of them had involved anything remotely like this. 3 weeks before the formation's projected entry into the outer system, Senior Director Avon Solith called me into her office and told me I was being reassigned. I was given a 47-volume briefing packet on Varath Sen culture, law, and diplomatic protocol. I was given an additional 12-volume supplement on royal court procedure. The Varath Sen are a dynastic species, organized around a hereditary sovereign line of considerable antiquity. I was given a single-volume summary of what the analysts believed the Queen intended. She was coming to offer a bond. Not a military bond, not a commercial bond, a dynastic one. The Varath Sen had a tradition, ancient, embedded in their founding charter, practiced for as long as their records went back, of resolving contested colonial claims through the offering of a royal daughter. Not a real marriage in the human sense. More precisely, the Queen would offer one of her daughters to the leadership of the contested world as a formal representative of the Varath Sen royal line, to be housed, honored, and treated as a permanent diplomatic presence. In their law, such an arrangement simultaneously acknowledged the contested world's inhabited status and bound its sovereign authority into the Varath Sen's hierarchical system as an affiliated holding. It was, in their framework, an act of extraordinary generosity. It was also, in their framework, unanswerable. No holding had ever refused it. The acceptance of a royal daughter was considered the highest honor the Varath Sen sovereign could bestow. In 46,000 years of Varath Sen diplomatic history, not one world had said no. The analysts had flagged this as a potential complication. One of the briefing volumes, Volume 31, Psychological and Cultural Leverage in Varath Sen Contact Events, devoted 60 pages to the specific pressure the offering created. The shame of refusal in their framework was not the shame of the world that refused. It was the shame of the world's leaders who had failed to honor a sovereign gift. The tradition had been engineered over millennia to make refusal feel like arrogance, like ingratitude, like a fundamental misunderstanding of the honor being offered. Director Solith was more direct about it when she handed me the brief. "They are going to bring the girl to the table," she said, "and they are going to expect us to be overwhelmed." "And if we're not?" I asked. She looked at me the way a woman looks at a junior officer who has just asked a question he already knows the answer to. "That," she said, is what you're there to manage. I spent those 3 weeks reviewing the briefing materials in the mornings and walking the Atlantic shore in the evenings. The shore here is a working coastline. The Accord's maritime monitoring arrays run out into the water from the compound's southern edge, and you can see the maintenance crews on the catwalk at low tide. I watched them one evening and thought about the Outer Ring buoy network 11 months prior, when a Class 3 monitoring drone at the edge of approach vector Caliph 7 had flagged an unrecognized drive signature and sent a routine Priority 2 alert that had reached an analyst's desk at 3:47 and been upgraded to Priority 1 within the hour. Routine. All of it routine. The machinery of a civilization that has been watching its own approaches for 34,000 years and does not stop watching just because the approaches stay quiet for a long stretch. I went through the legal arguments every night before I slept. I had them in a specific order, and I kept to that order, because the sequence mattered as much as the content. The first argument needed to be procedural, something the Queen's legal officer could verify in the archive within minutes and could not dispute without disputing his own charter. The second needed to be structural, something that voided the offering before it reached the table, not after. The third was something different in kind from the first two, and I had spent the most time with it. It was not a legal argument at all. It was a factual one. And the distinction between those two things is where the real weight lies. The formation dropped into the outer system at 3:12 on a Tuesday morning and immediately transmitted a Priority 1 diplomatic hail on the Theron Compact's standard contact frequency. The hail was in Old Compact Standard, the formal register used for inter-sovereign communication of the highest order. Our translation layer rendered it in under 4 seconds. Formal notification of the Varath Sen Royal Sovereign's personal arrival in system, her intention to conduct direct diplomatic engagement with the authority of holding Kale 19, and her request for escort to the designated contact facility. The Accord response formation, 387 warships, including 4 capital vessels, all of them staged in the Kareth Deep Shadow for 11 months, acknowledged the hail and moved into escort position without a word of threat or drama. The formation's command vessel transmitted a polite confirmation of the escort arrangement, a welcome in Old Compact Standard, and a single attachment. The cover page of the Counter-Sovereignty Archive, 4 lines of text that cited the archive's Theron registration number, its page count, and the date of its certification. 4 lines. That was all we sent at first, just enough to let the Queen's legal staff understand what was waiting for them. The formation went quiet for 6 hours after receiving that cover page. I was in the Accord diplomatic shore compound during those 6 hours, going through my protocol notes and watching the sea through the east windows. The morning light came up over the water slow and clean, and I thought about the analysts who had built that archive, generation after generation, none of them knowing for certain whether the Varath Sen would ever actually come, believing they would, working as if they would, passing the project to their children like a piece of unfinished furniture, trusting that whoever came after them would understand the shape of the thing and keep going. That is the only note that matters about what it means to be human, in the long dark between the stars, when everyone else has forgotten you exist. The Queen's flagship, a vessel named the Ascending Voice of Sovereign Certainty, which our translators rendered with a slightly uncomfortable literalness that I chose not to examine too closely, came into parking orbit at 1847 local time on the 3rd day. The escort shuttle descended through cloud cover and touched down on the compound's reception pad at 9:11 the following morning. I was standing at the foot of the ramp when the door opened. There were 7 of them. The Queen traveled with a formal diplomatic party, 2 senior advisors in the deep blue ceremonial armor of the royal court, 2 aides in functional silver carapace, 1 legal officer carrying what I recognized from the briefings as a portable archive terminal, a slender black column about a meter tall, containing the legal instruments she intended to present. and then the queen herself, with the princess beside her. I want to describe them accurately, because it matters for what comes later. The Varathsen are not humanoid in the way some species approximate our shape. They are taller, bilaterally symmetric, but with an additional joint structure in the upper limbs that gives their gestures a quality of fluid extension, like watching someone reach through water. Their skin is a pale iridescent gray, with bioluminescent nodes along the jaw and collarbone that shift color with emotional state, the way a human face shifts expression. Their eyes are large and set wide, with a deep amber iris that the briefing materials noted was culturally associated with sovereign authority. The royal line's eyes were distinctly darker, almost copper. The queen was striking, not in a way that translated as threatening or beautiful by human standards. Her features were too angular, her proportions too unfamiliar. But there was an undeniable quality of command to the way she moved, an economy of gesture that said she had never in her life walked into a room where she was not the most important entity present. She wore the formal court armor of the royal line, deep blue, articulated, with gold rank nodes at the shoulder and collarbone, and a sash across the upper thorax in deep-water blue. She moved through the morning light on the reception pad as though the light had arranged itself for her convenience, and perhaps in all the rooms she had ever stood in, it had. The princess was young. I had been told this in the brief and had read the age conversion tables, but the conversion tables don't quite prepare you for the reality of it. She was, in Varathsen developmental terms, the equivalent of perhaps 14 or 15 years. She moved with the slightly rigid posture of a young person who had been extensively trained in formal comportment, and was applying that training with great concentration. Her bioluminescent nodes were cycling through what the briefing identified as the pale blue pattern for controlled apprehension. She was nervous, and she was working very hard not to show it. Her name, as best our translators could render it, was Seilvorniketh, the third daughter of the Queen Sovereign. The briefing had been careful to note that in Varathsen culture, the offering of the third daughter was specific. It meant the most that the sovereign was willing to give while retaining the succession. First daughters were heirs. Second daughters were bound to internal court positions. Third daughters were the gift that cost the queen something real. She was very young, and she was holding a formal presentation case in both hands, and her jaw nodes were cycling pale blue, and I looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds longer than protocol suggested. Not out of sentiment, out of the specific recognition that the thing being asked of me by the situation was not simply legal. It was human. What do you do in a marble room by the sea when the most powerful person in 4-star systems hands you her young daughter and asks you to say thank you? Then I stepped forward, placed my right hand over my sternum in the accord's formal greeting gesture, and addressed the queen in old compact standard. Sovereign of the Varathsen royal line, holder of the ascending voice, Accord's senior first contact liaison Davin Keln of Holding Kale 19 welcomes you to the Accord Grand Reception Hall. The Accord has prepared a full session for your diplomatic submission. She inclined her head. The copper-amber eyes took me in with the exact quality of attention that senior commanders give to things they are still deciding how to classify. We walked inside. The session opened with the formal exchange of credentials, my Accord appointment documentation, her sovereign certification. The legal officer presented the portable archive terminal and offered the Varathsen colonial registration for Holding Kale 19, which I accepted with both hands in the standard receipt gesture, placed on the table, and did not open. Our legal team's response was to transmit the Counter-Sovereignty Archive's full table of contents to the formation's legal channel, all 312 million pages indexed and cross-referenced, with a note that the physical archive was available for inspection at the Accord's Calith Deep Vault facility, should the Queen's legal staff require direct access. The Queen's legal officer, a dignified male whose jaw nodes held a very steady deep green throughout, which the brief identified as professional composure under stress, reviewed the table of contents on the terminal screen for 11 minutes without speaking. The Queen watched him. The two senior advisors watched me. The princess watched the sea through the east windows. At the end of the 11 minutes, the legal officer leaned toward the Queen and spoke quietly in the primary royal register. I will paraphrase. He confirmed that the archive appeared to be what its registration claimed, that preliminary indexing indicated it drew entirely from Varath Sen instruments, and that a full legal review would require considerable time, more time than the session allowed for. The Queen absorbed this with the stillness of someone who had not expected it but had considered the possibility. She had good advisors. She was a careful woman who had been doing this for a long time. The stillness was not the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of a mind that had prepared multiple responses and was now selecting among them. She looked at me. The copper eyes were steady. When she spoke, she chose to address me directly in old compact standard, a deliberate choice, I understood, to signal that she considered this a personal exchange rather than a procedural one. Liaison Keln, she said, the law is the law and I respect your archive. I was not unaware that you would have one. However, what I bring to this table is beyond the law's reach. It is a gift of the sovereign line itself. She gestured, and the princess stepped forward and placed the formal presentation case on the table with both hands. The pale blue nodes had steadied somewhat. Whatever the girl was feeling, she had made a decision to set it aside, and she was holding to that decision with a steadiness that I thought, privately, spoke well of her. My daughter, Sail Vorniketh, third of the royal line, the Queen said, presented freely and with full honor to the authority of holding Kale 19 as a bond of sovereign recognition. This offer has not been refused in 46,000 years of Varath Sen diplomatic practice. It supersedes colonial claims. It supersedes legal records. It is a recognition of your world as a peer by the highest authority in 4-star systems. Tell me, Liaison Keln, what archive refutes a gesture of that quality? The room was quiet. The sea moved outside. The morning light had shifted from pale to warm gold, the way it does along the Atlantic coast in the middle hours, and it caught the edge of the presentation case and the edge of the girl's formal collar and the copper of the Queen's eyes all at once. I looked at the princess. She was looking at me. Her jaw nodes had gone a very faint, steady blue, not the cycling apprehension of before, but something quieter held. She knew what a refusal meant, I realized. She had been prepared for the possibility. She was waiting to see what I would do, with a maturity that struck me as entirely out of proportion to her years. I looked back at the Queen. Your sovereign, I said. I will answer your question directly, as the Accord's protocol for first contact sessions requires. I placed both hands flat on the table, the way my old training instructor at Varath Kale had taught me, not as a gesture of aggression, but as a signal of weight, that what followed was not procedural, was not diplomatic formula, but was the actual thing being said by the actual person saying it. I reject your daughter's presentation, I said, on 3 grounds, each of which is binding under the Varath Sen founding charter, which your legal officer will find indexed in the Counter-Sovereignty Archive under Registration Class 1, Primary Instruments. The Queen's jaw nodes, which had been a steady, authoritative copper gold throughout the session, flickered once, just once, then held. The first ground, I said. Your founding charter's bond offering protocol, Section 7, Article 2, which established the tradition 41,000 years ago, specifies that a royal bond may only be offered to a world that lacks a recognized sovereign authority of its own. The Accord is a recognized sovereign authority under Theron Compact registration, filed 12,000 years ago and reviewed without challenge 11 times since. Your legal officer will find this on page 47 of the archive's first index. Holding Kale 19 ceased to be available for bond offering the day the Accord registered. We have been unavailable for 34,000 years. I paused. I let the number sit in the room. The second ground, I continued. Your bond-offering tradition again, your own charter, Section 7, Article 4, requires the informed and uncoerced consent of the offered party before the presentation is made. I have not given that consent. More precisely, no authority of the Accord gave that consent at any point in the 11 months since your formation entered our detection range. You transmitted a diplomatic hail. We acknowledged it. The consent required by your own law was never sought and was never provided. The presentation is therefore procedurally void before it reaches the table. The legal officer's jaw nodes had gone a steady, deep green again. He was writing something on the terminal, fast, economical strokes, the notes of a professional who is simultaneously impressed and in significant difficulty, and who is too well trained to let either show on his face. The third ground, I said, and this is the one I want you to hear most clearly, your sovereign. The tradition of the bond offering, in your founding charter's own language, was established to honor worlds whose development was still proceeding, worlds that were, in the charter's phrase, ascending toward a civilization worthy of sovereign contact. The word ascending is your charter's word. We have the original registration. Holding Kale 19 was classified as ascending 46,000 years ago. I stopped for a moment, not for effect, because what came next was the third argument, and I wanted to say it simply. I submit to you, and your legal officer may verify this in the archive's third major section, that a world which has been operating a Theron Compact sovereignty registration for 34,000 years, which maintains a defense formation currently stationed in your escort position, and which has spent 39,000 years preparing a legal archive drawn entirely from your own instruments. That world is not ascending. We arrived some time ago. The bond-offering tradition, by your own charter's framing, has no provision for a world that arrived without your assistance. We have been a civilization in our own right for longer than your tradition has existed. You cannot offer recognition to a world that recognized itself before you noticed we were still here. The room was very quiet. Outside, the Atlantic moved. A seabird crossed the top of the east window, a dark line against the gold sky, and was gone. The Queen looked at me for a long time. I did not look away. There is a school of thought among Accord diplomatic staff that you should soften your gaze during a moment of refusal, that the maintenance of direct eye contact reads as aggression in species with large, light-sensitive eyes. I had read that school of thought and I disagreed with it. Softening your gaze in a moment like that reads as apology, and I had nothing to apologize for. What I had was 312 million pages of Varath Sen, law saying that I was right. The copper eyes held. Then slowly, the Queen's jaw nodes shifted. The authoritative gold faded. What replaced it was something I had not seen on a Varath Sen face before. The briefings hadn't prepared me for it, because it was not a color or a pattern the analysts had thought to catalog. It was a very faint, very slow cycling between pale silver and warm amber, like light moving through water. Later, when I filed my contact report, I included a note that I believed this to be the color pattern for reassessment, for the specific experience of recalibrating an assumption you had held for a very long time. The analysts added it to the database. They told me afterward that no previous human contact officer had ever prompted that particular display in a Varath Sen sovereign. You have studied us, the Queen said, not an accusation, something quieter than that. We have studied you for 46,000 years, I said. We have had nothing but time and reason to be thorough. She was quiet again. The legal officer had stopped writing and was watching her. The advisors were watching me. The aides had not moved. The princess had not moved either. I had been aware of her throughout the session, peripherally, the way you are aware of something that is both important and not yet relevant. But in the silence after the Queen's last words, I was more aware of her. She had not been surprised by the refusal the way the others had. Her nodes had not flickered or shifted. She had watched the exchange with the quality of attention that belongs to a very young person who is understanding something they had suspected, but not yet confirmed. The Queen looked at her daughter, then back at me. "You said 3 grounds for rejection," she said. "You did not say rejection with prejudice." That was very precise. The distinction in Theron compact diplomatic law between rejection and rejection with prejudice is narrow but significant. Rejection with prejudice closes a claim permanently. Rejection alone closes it for the present contact session and invites further dialogue. She was a careful woman. "Rejection," I confirmed, "not with prejudice." She inhaled, a long, slow movement of the gill structure along her upper thorax. "Then tell me what the accord does accept." "A Theron Compact bilateral recognition agreement," I said. "Standard form, 2 sovereign parties, mutual acknowledgement of territorial boundaries, opening of a commercial and scientific exchange channel, and a formal compact filing that closes the colonial registration permanently and reclassifies holding Kale 19 as sovereign state Caliph under accord designation. Your legal officer knows the form. We have prepared a draft. It is in the archive under the final index section." The legal officer confirmed this with a single nod, before the Queen had even looked at him. The Queen considered. The silver-amber cycle in her jaw nodes slowed, steadied, shifted gradually toward something I had no name for. The analysts would later catalog it as a copper tone they hadn't seen before either, which they provisionally called resolution. "And my daughter," she said. "Your daughter," I said carefully, "is welcome to remain at the Accord Grand Reception Hall for the duration of the bilateral negotiation, as a guest of the Accord, with full diplomatic honors, in whatever capacity you consider appropriate. We have prepared a separate suite for her use. There are staff assigned who are briefed on Varathsen dietary and environmental needs." The Queen looked at her daughter again. The girl met her mother's eyes without flinching. "Sale Vorniketh," the Queen said quietly in the primary royal register, not old compact standard, a private address, not a diplomatic one. "What do you think?" I want you to understand that this was not a normal thing. In the briefing materials on Varathsen Royal Court Protocol, the Queen Sovereign's direct address to a presented daughter in the middle of a diplomatic session was classified as essentially unprecedented. Daughters presented for bond offering did not weigh in. The offering was the Queen's decision and the Queen's alone. It had always been so. "But," she asked. The princess looked at her mother for a long moment, then she looked at me. The pale blue nodes had shifted while I wasn't watching. They were warm gold now, a shade lighter than her mother's authority copper, but unmistakably in the same family. I looked it up later. The briefing materials didn't have it. The analysts who reviewed my report added it to the database with a note that they believed it was a color specific to the royal line's expression of confident decision. "I think," Sale Vorniketh said, carefully, in old compact standard, her first words in the session, "that they have earned the right to be asked, rather than offered." The room was quiet for a long time. Then the Queen did something that the briefing materials had not prepared me for, and that I have never seen in any account of Varathsen diplomatic contact before or since. She placed both hands flat on the table. The same gesture I had used, the wait signal, the sign of the actual thing being said by the actual person saying it. "Then we will negotiate," she said. The bilateral session ran for 4 days. It was not simple. Varathsen law had 46,000 years of accumulated complexity, and the colonial registration unwinding required careful work from both legal teams. There were 6 points where the session came close to breaking down, and on the 3rd day there was a 3-hour recess during which the Queen's legal officer and our team conducted a parallel review of a specific precedent case from 11,000 years ago that neither side had initially known the other possessed. On the evening of the second day, I had dinner alone in the east wing of the compound, looking at the Atlantic through the long windows. The princess's suite was 2 floors above me. I had not spoken to her since the session began in earnest, but a staff liaison had reported that she had spent most of the afternoon in the diplomatic library, that she had asked, specifically, for access to the founding generation entries of the Counter-Sovereignty Archive, the ones written 11,000 years ago by the Kale listeners and their immediate successors. I thought about that for a long time. A 14-year-old girl, in an unfamiliar building on an unfamiliar world, reading the first pages of a project that had been begun before her species had any idea this world was still occupied. Reading the words of people who were working blind and working anyway, who had no certainty and no guarantee, and kept going because they understood that the work was the answer, whether or not anyone ever came to ask the question. I ate my dinner slowly and watched the Atlantic in the last of the evening light. The compound's outer monitoring ring was cycling its normal interval sweeps. I could see the green status lights on the coastal array from where I sat, and beyond them the dark water, and beyond that nothing visible, which did not mean nothing was there. It never does. I thought about the Queen, 2 floors above in the diplomatic reception suite, where she had been meeting with her legal officer for most of the afternoon. I thought about what it must feel like to be her, to have come this far, with that much preparation of her own, carrying a tradition that had never failed in 46,000 years, and to sit in a marble room while a man who was not a king and not a warlord and not a sovereign in any sense she was accustomed to respecting placed his hands flat on a table and told her, in careful legal language derived entirely from her own charter, that the most powerful gesture she knew how to make had no jurisdiction here. I do not think the Queen was a cruel person. Nothing in the briefing materials had suggested cruelty, and nothing in the session had confirmed it. She was a sovereign who had operated within a system that had worked for as long as her civilization could remember, and she had come here believing, on good available evidence, that the system would work again. The bond offering had not failed because she had miscalculated. It had failed because 46,000 years had changed the nature of the problem in ways that her system had never been designed to account for. That distinction matters. It matters to how you treat someone when you refuse them. The bilateral session held, point by careful point it held. I want to say something about what it is to negotiate with someone who is both a formidable adversary and, by the end of the second day, something you have come to respect in the particular way you respect people who are good at what they do and who, when they find the limits of their position, accept those limits with grace rather than manufacturing a crisis. The Queen's legal officer was exactly that kind of professional. He found 11 places in the first day where he could have raised procedural objections that would have extended the session by days or broken it entirely, and in each case he raised the objection, heard the counter-argument, verified it in the archive, and moved on. No theater. No insistence on being difficult. Work done by someone who understood that the work was the point. The Queen herself spoke very little on the second and third days. She attended every session. She read everything her legal officer flagged for her review. On one occasion, the 3-hour recess on the third day, during the parallel review of the 11,000-year precedent case, she walked down to the East Wing corridor and stood at the window looking at the Atlantic for the duration of the recess. I passed her once on my way back from the communications room. We did not speak. We did not need to. There are moments in contact work when the protocol falls away, and 2 people are simply in the same building, waiting for the same thing to resolve, and the most honest thing you can do is let that be what it is. The terms, the colonial registration for holding Kale 19 was permanently voided under Theron Compact Section 41. Sovereign state Caliph was recognized as a compact-registered independent sovereignty. A bilateral commercial and scientific exchange channel was opened. The Varath-Sen formation was given safe passage and full escort to the system's outer marker. and a small additional provision was added, at the request of the princess, which the queen approved without deliberation, a permanent cultural exchange program, specifically focused on the translation and mutual study of each species' archival records. Sale-Vorniketh was designated the Varath Sen's first cultural exchange coordinator under the new bilateral agreement. She would spend 2 years at the Accord's Calith Shore compound before returning home. That was not in the brief. None of it had been in the brief, because none of it had been anticipated. The bond offering was supposed to be unanswerable. It had never been refused. The tradition was meant to settle things without requiring the queen to acknowledge that the world in question had grown up. What changed it, what I have thought about on many quiet evenings since, was not the legal arguments, though the legal arguments were airtight. It was not the 312 million pages, though they were decisive. What changed it was the princess asking to stay. Because it was a choice. Not an offering, not a placement, not an arrangement made by a sovereign for a political purpose. A choice made by a 14-year-old girl who had listened to 2 hours of legal argument in a language she had been studying for 11 months on the voyage here, and had reached a conclusion her mother respected enough to act on. I filed my contact report on the evening of the 4th day, after the formation had cleared the outer system, and the escort vessels had returned to their posts. Director Solith read it the same night and called me at 2200. She asked the girl, Solith said. She did, I said. In session. Yes. There was a pause. How long have you been doing this? 9 years of liaison work, I said. 14 of frontier monitoring before that. And you've never seen that? Not in any record I've read, I said. Not in 23,000 years of compact documentation on Varath Sen contact events. Another pause. Davin, she said, what do you think happened in that room? I had been thinking about that question since the queen had placed her hands on the table. I thought about it for another moment before answering. I think, I said, that the queen came here knowing what we had. Not specifically, she didn't know the archive's page count or its registration date, but she knew we weren't the world they'd filed on 46,000 years ago. Her legal staff would have told her that the moment they picked up our compact registration 11 months ago. She came anyway. Why? Solith asked. Because the bond offering was the only move she had that operated outside the law, I said. The only gesture that could supersede an archive in principle. She was testing whether there was something we wanted more than our sovereignty, whether we could be moved by honor, by flattery, by the idea of a connection to a royal line 4 star systems wide. And when we couldn't, Solith said. When we couldn't, I said, she asked her daughter what she thought, because that is what you do when the script runs out and you are actually in the room with someone who surprised you. You stop performing and you start talking. There was a long quiet on the line. How old is the girl? Solith asked. 14, in their developmental equivalent. And she chose to stay. She asked to stay, I said. There's a difference. Solith was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said at last. There is. Sale-Vorniketh arrived at the Accord Shore compound on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the formation's departure, aboard a small diplomatic courier that the Queen had sent back specifically for the purpose. She came with 2 aides, a personal archive terminal loaded with the entirety of the Varath Sen's cultural record library, and a formal letter from her mother that I was asked to transmit to the Accord's diplomatic registry. The letter, I read it once in translation before sending it on, was brief. It said that the Queen of the Varath Sen acknowledged the sovereignty of Calith without condition, wished the bilateral agreement well, and had sent her daughter not as a gift, not as a bond, and not as a diplomatic instrument, but as a student. I thought about that word for a long time. Student. In a species whose entire tradition had been built around presenting daughters as symbols of sovereign generosity, As objects of diplomatic transaction, the Queen of the Varethsen had found the one framing that placed her daughter back in her own hands. The last line of the letter said, "She asked to go. That is the first time in 46,000 years that anyone in our royal line has chosen their own posting. We consider this, perhaps, worth more than what we came to offer." I have read a great many diplomatic communications in 23 years of contact work. I have read formal capitulations and bitter legal filings and quiet withdrawals and defiant protests. I have read communications that required 47 rounds of translation refinement before they said what their authors intended, and I have read communications that said exactly what they meant in the first line, and then spent 12 pages being careful about it. That letter is the one I have read the most times. Sale Vorniketh spent 27 months at the Accord Shore compound. She was, in the assessment of every staff member who worked with her, the most intellectually formidable student our Cultural Exchange Division had ever hosted. She learned the primary and secondary Accord linguistic registers in 8 months, a pace our language faculty described, with a mixture of admiration and mild professional embarrassment, as the fastest acquisition curve they had measured in 40 years of hosting exchange students. By month 10, she was reading untranslated compact legal documents in the original Middle Register Old Standard, and by month 12, she had begun corresponding directly with the Accord's Caliph Deep Vault archivists in their professional dialect, requesting specific index cross-references without assistance from the translation staff. She was curious in a way that was not performative. I have met a great many people over the years who ask questions because they know they are supposed to, and a smaller number who ask questions because they genuinely cannot rest until they understand. She was the latter kind, and she was also honest about what she didn't know, which is a quality I have always found rarer than intelligence. When she was wrong, and she was wrong, sometimes, on points of Accord legal precedent or the specific meaning of a historical term, she corrected herself clearly and without embarrassment, filed the correction in her own notes, and asked a follow-up question within the minute. What she was working on, in the afternoons when the formal study sessions had finished, was something she described to me one evening as a comparative analysis of institutional memory systems. She meant the Varathsen's tradition of oral royal court records, held in the memories of dedicated court historians, passed in continuous chain from sovereign to sovereign, against the Accord's written archival model. She was, she told me, trying to understand how the two systems had each preserved something important over a very long time, and what each had lost in the process that the other had kept. I told her that I thought that was a question worth more than 27 months. She agreed, with the particular quality of agreement that means, "I know, and I am going to spend a long time on it regardless." She produced a 700-page translation analysis of the Counter-Sovereignty Archive's founding generation of entries, the ones written 11,000 years ago, when the team that built the project was in its first decade and still working out what the project was supposed to be. Her analysis, when our archivists reviewed it, corrected 11 translation errors in the archive's own cross-references that had been missed for the entire 39,000 years the project had been running. The archivist who filed the correction report, a senior cataloger named Veth Doran, 28 years in the vault, who had reviewed the founding generation entries himself in his 3rd year, and found nothing amiss, told me afterward that the errors were subtle enough that he was not certain he would have caught them even if he had been looking specifically for them. He told me that 2 of them altered, in small but meaningful ways, the legal interpretation of the 3rd argument I had made in the session, the ascending world argument. I thought about that. I thought about the possibility that the argument I had made from memory and briefing materials had rested, in part, on a slightly imprecise reading of the Charter's original language. And I thought about the fact that the person who found the imprecision was the daughter of the Queen, I had made the argument too. I mentioned this to Sale Vorniketh the week before she left. I told her that I appreciated the irony. She said, in a tone that was entirely level and professional, "The corrected version of the argument is stronger than the one you made in the session. You were right. You were just not as precisely right as you could have been." Then, after a pause, "I thought you should know." That was her. That was entirely her. She left on a cold Thursday in November, 2 years and 3 months after she arrived. The diplomatic courier that came for her was a different vessel than the first, larger, a formal royal escort rather than a transit craft. The Queen had sent something worth looking at. I walked her to the pad. It was raining, the way the Atlantic coast rains in November, not hard, just steady, a gray wash over everything. She wore the Accord's guest diplomatic sash over her Varathsen formal coat, which was the first time in the compound's history that anyone had combined the two. Our protocol staff had never had occasion to rule on whether it was appropriate, and in the end they decided it was and left it at that. At the foot of the ramp, she turned and looked at me. The warm gold nodes I had first seen when she made her choice in the reception hall, the ones the analysts had catalogued as the royal line's expression of confident decision, were running steady and even. "Liaison Kelm," she said. "Sale Vorniketh," I said. "When I go back," she said, "I am going to tell my mother that you answered her question." "I did answer her question," I said. "Not the first one," she said. "The first one was why you rejected the offering. You answered that in the session." A pause. "I mean the real question, the one she didn't ask out loud." I waited. "She wanted to know," Sale Vorniketh said, "whether you were people, whether 46,000 years had made something here that was worth engaging with, not as a subject, not as a holding, not as a world in the Compact's registry, as people." The rain came down steadily across the pad, across the Atlantic, across everything. "And the answer," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked up the ramp, calm and straight-backed, the Accord sash bright against the gray morning. At the top she paused, and without turning around she said, "She already knew the answer before she asked. She just needed to see if you did." The ramp closed. The courier lifted smoothly through the rain and climbed into the cloud layer and was gone. I stood there for a little while. The Atlantic moved. The rain came down. Somewhere behind me, inside the compound, the day's first communication traffic was already cycling through. Routine reports, maintenance logs, the quiet administrative machinery of a sovereignty that has been running for 34,000 years without stopping, without forgetting, without once losing sight of the simple, stone-hard fact that memory is preparation, and preparation is the only thing that makes a choice possible. The Queen had come to give us something we didn't need, and we had given her something she hadn't expected. Not the legal record, not the fleet in the shadow of the asteroid. Something smaller than that and harder to build and worth more than 46,000 years of registered claims. We gave her a daughter who had learned to choose. I walked back inside out of the rain, sat down at my desk, and began writing the follow-up contact report. There was more work to do. There always is.